Hi, everyone. I'm Ryan McCarty. I'm a lecturer in the English Department Writing program at the University of Michigan, and I'm here to talk about teaching first-year writing with the Michigan Corpus of Upper-Level Student Papers, or MICUSP. This is a video that's going to provide sort of a practical idea about one way that you could use this in a lesson in class. Make sure you check out Laura All's introduction to MICUSP, which is linked down in the comments. Right? First of all, like the main goal for using this kind of corpus is to help students understand how texts work. We're going to read texts like writers to figure out how a particular writer will use a particular feature. We do this to encourage students to see the ways that writing is differing according to audience and purpose and genre and broader context. We don't write the same for all situations. We write according to a set of expectations. And even when we bend them slightly, those are sort of predictable ways to bend. And we can help students learn to understand these differences by, as I said, teaching them to read like writers. They're not just reading for content, but they're reading to understand how the texts work. And we assume that if students can look at examples of texts we ask them to produce, they have a better chance of effectively writing those kinds of texts. And students are constantly asking me for examples, and MICUSP offers a really great place to find a lot of different examples according to different genres. This is a collection of A-graded upper-level writing from across the disciplines written by University of Michigan students. So it's great for people anywhere, but especially for teachers at the University of Michigan. This gives students a sense of what kind of writing they might be targeting next. And this is maybe a lot easier than asking students to look at publish research articles in their future field of study because that's sort of a lot of steps outside of their zone of proximal development, right? They're not going to go from high school English class all the way up to writing a research article that's going to be published in Nature Biology in one step. So we're giving them sort of an intermediary step. If you look at MICUSP, texts are broken down by discipline. It's a ton of different examples from engineering to political science to English, and also broken down by larger text types. So things like argument, research paper, proposal, report. But as a first-year writing teacher in an English class, when might I actually use this? I like to do it in an early close reading assignment that I ask students to find and analyze how a given text works. This kind of builds on their experience doing rhetorical analyses in a 12th grade class. This is a really common assignment, but it goes beyond just what are the tricks the author's using to look to understand how that text actually works. It's also really good for comparative assignments that ask students to investigate similarities and differences in approaches to writing in different contexts. Sometimes I like students to look at the kind of thing that might be written as an argument in a standard literary English class assignment, which is something they're sort of familiar with from 12th grade often, and see how that's different from something that's written in psychology or in biology or in whatever field that they'd like to look at. It's also a really great resource for discourse community or community of practice projects that ask students to delve into the writing practices of particular academic discipline. So if students say, I want to major in biology because I'm pre-med, or I want to major in political science because I want to go into organizing and advocacy, then those are projects that I can say, well, look at MICUSP and see how all of the writing is working, see if you can find some patterns and begin to understand how that community of practice works. And we move into this in an early lesson, and what this could look like for you in practice actually is to ask students to do something like investigating the ways writers incorporate other voices in their writing. This includes quotations, but also summary, paraphrase, and other things depending on the discipline. So I want to look today at an early lesson using what I call analytical noticing. Basically, I just give students tools to dive into a text and see what they find when comparing it to other texts and writing practices that they bring with them. Asking them, look at it. What do you notice about how the authors do this? How is that like or unlike how you've been taught to do that particular thing? Have you ever thought about this as a series of choices? Did you know that you could do it in this way? And of course, I don't just dive in and say, check things out and notice, but I give them a little bit of a demo. So I want to look at how I would do that in a class. So I would set it up and say that we're going to use this process of noticing. We would begin by preloading and saying, okay, what do you do when you incorporate other people's voices into a text? What have you been taught? What do you know? And they would say all kinds of things about introducing the quote and using quotation marks, citing other people's information, things like that. And then I'd say, okay, let's look at how a text from sociology does this. And so let's see how that would work. And so then I pop up and we have the MICUSP interface. As you see here, there's a breakdown of the different disciplines. There's a breakdown of the different text types. And again, here, there's a breakdown of the different disciplines that you can select from. So I'm going to say, let's look in sociology, and I'll work through this with students in order to have them see what it is that you can do with this interface. So then we've reduced, and now we have 72 papers in sociology and a breakdown of the different kinds. So there's lots of reports, there's lots of argumentative essays, and things named things like critique and research. And so because we were looking at argument, we're going to go to, you can see I've already clicked on it, this piece on gender in schools. And if you hover over it, it'll tell you things like it was written by a final year undergraduate, it was female, they were a native speaker, and that it's an argumentative essay, and it has reference to sources. So these are all things that students can see before they even go in. And when you open up the text, it's that information is replicated up here. There's also a word cloud to sort of give you an idea of the focus. We see lots about gender and girls and boys. Sometimes that's an interesting thing to think about, to compare the kinds of word clouds if you're searching the same kinds of topics. But then for this, I would zoom right down to the place where I first see a use of citations. And what I would do is walk through with students and just begin noticing these things. So I would begin with, for instance, this sentence here and say, the distinction between genders began as a difference in biology, colon, and then a quote. What I notice is that this is setting up a definition, and it's providing me with a history. So one way in sociology that we use quotes is to substantiate a definition and a history. Gender activities emerge from and bolster claims to a membership in a sex category. And so that's one way that that quotes are integrated. We notice that unlike the way that students have been taught in high school English frequently, there isn't an according to West and Zimmerman or a naming of a text. There is just the author's words and then the words of whoever they're citing. And then it's followed directly by parentheticals. And I also teach them, this is a great way to learn how to do citations, that West and Zimmerman, so last name and last name, year of publication, comma, P 127, end parentheses, period. And so those are even things that I ask them to notice and that I would make really explicit in my demo. Then I'd say, so that's one way that people use quotations. Then I would go down to the next one. And again, we see that it's all the author's words, not the words that are being quoted. So we would say then, this is a way that in sociology that you can use others' words. You can paraphrase them, though even these presumed differentiating characteristics are not finite, and there are many empirical exemptions. And then citation, and that's not even the end of the end of the sentence. So for students, they would say, oh, this is that they're paraphrasing or summarizing the author's ideas, and that this might be a big concept from Fausto Sterling, but not one that they felt like they needed to quote directly. So we can see that this is one way that that words of other writers are used in sociology. And then I would probably point out that the sentence continues. The prevailing societal thought is that the sex of males and females is different. So this is then, we would discuss that it's the author's words, that it's not something that's being attributed directly to Fausto Sterling, but this is the writer themselves building on the words that they were talking about from another writer. So this is a moment where we could say there's no I claim in this. There's no I think or I feel or my opinion is, but that this is a moment where the writer is signaling to readers that this is their view, or these are their interpretations of the situation. So this is a place that students find really interesting sometimes because it shows them how you can signal your view without using I, which they're very conditioned not to use, but also they're sure that there might be some way to get themselves into the text, right? So by looking at this example, they can begin to see things like that. There's also this kind of quotation here. And that we would talk about what that means there, that we're pretty sure it's not quoting anyone, but maybe it's quoting everyone, that this is the way that we use gender. And in fact, it's the colloquial use of gender has evolved into, and that this is something that is not somebody else's words, but it's drawing attention to the use of a word. And then finally, we would look at this interesting final sentence, which is early in this piece of writing and is coming really close to looking like what the writer of this paper is arguing, but there's a citation at the end. There's a use of this very clear certainty word, gender should be understood as this. It's a recommendation. It's something that's being argued for. But there's this citation at the end. And so what we would talk about with students is what we think Connell 2002 is about and how much of this entire sentence could be attributed to them, or how much we think that this is maybe just built into major social institutions or something like that. And what we would probably do in this moment is go into a little bit of a critical mode and say, this seems like something that a successful writer could do, but we're not entirely sure about how we like that move, and that maybe whatever Connell 2002 is responsible for, we would like to see it moved into a sentence that precedes this one, which is sort of laying out what the author themselves is arguing for. So after going through this process of noticing and dialoguing through and just saying, what do we see about this? How does it compare to what you would do? Would you ever do this? We would come up with a couple of observations for how incorporation of text seems to work in sociology. We would notice that you don't have to, in text like this, introduce the author before the quotation. Although students would be very quick to point out that down below, that can be done sometimes, but it's not necessary. And this is surprising to students because a lot of them have been drilled to really think that you must use the according to or in the words of or some other marker like that before introducing a quotation. But we see that you don't have to. There's also things to be learned about how you actually do the citation on a paper like this. And it's important to always point out to students that citation is a little bit of a fickle thing, and that there's likely to be slight distinctions for every instructor, a little bit of preference, not just MLA or APA, but just little preferences, like there are, as we know, for different academic journals. Editors and teachers all seem to have their own tiny quirks that they want to put on things. We also would note like the ways that you can break sentences for what writers are saying in other texts, and how writers of this text, the student writer, is including their own language and their own ideas. And so then at this point, I would say, excellent. Now, how do you think this differs or overlaps with other kinds of texts? So after doing this together, we would move into some comparative and contrastive noticing groups. And at this point, I would ask students in small groups to select another discipline, and they would go through and maybe look at biology or economics or political science. In other situations, if I don't have students that are selecting their own disciplines, I might even assign them and say, this group is going to look at mechanical engineering, and see how you could look at sources in that way. And then other people are going to look at economics, and then we'll compare that to sociology. And as they come together, they can present what they found, especially if they could come up and click on the link and show the paper that they were looking at and walk through their noticings so that other students could begin to compare and contrast with what they found. Then, of course, if you have a long enough class, students could then replicate the analysis with the text they're analyzing for their own projects. So this is really nice because they've now seen somebody do a little bit of analytical noticing about how authors incorporate other words and ideas into a text. And then they've looked at it in one particular discipline and had time to talk with each other about it. And they've seen how other groups of students have done that kind of analytical noticing. But then they have time to sit down and say, okay, this text that I'm analyzing for my close reading or whatever the assignment may be, they've got a chance right there to say, okay, let me practice this on the thing that I'm writing right now. And if you've really got a good amount of time, if you've got maybe an hour and a half section or something like that, you can have time for them to turn just with a partner and share like their sort of early moments of analysis after doing that. So I hope that this gives you a sense of one way that you could dive in and use MICUSP for one kind of assignment with one kind of goal for students to understand. You could, of course, replicate the same process for helping them to understand main moves in introductions, which Laura All is going to produce another video of. You could do it to have them analyze certainty markers, like how strongly people make claims. Is there lots of shoulds and musts, or are there hedges where people say this seems like, or these findings suggest? And what does that mean for how writers work? So I hope that MICUSP is like an endless trove of possibilities for you to give students. It's demo texts from across the disciplines, and really a great resource to be able to have students do their own kind of exploration in order to understand how writing differs across contexts.